and come to find out, the will wasn't valid. And so his assets actually went to his estranged grandchildren who he had zero relationship with. And we're talking $1.5 million.
Most people don't believe it when I tell them, but 35% of for sale by owners actually end up in litigation after they close.
I think there's a big misconception that people think if they have a will, that means they don't have to go through probate. And Lana probably sees that when people try and sell a house and they're like, oh, it was willed to me. Well, you still have to go through the probate process. I hate to sound cliche and say everyone needs an estate plan.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chimes and Dimes, brought to you by First Wealth and Trust of Winter Garden. I'm Pete Bachsch, the Chief Investment Officer here at First Wealth and Trust. And I'm joined in this episode by Jennifer Bondi, the Principal Attorney at Bondi Law, and Lana Larrabee, who is a licensed residential realtor. And before we even jump into this, well, first of all, thank you all for being here.
But thanks for having me.
And as we jump off into this, I do have to send a little bit of a shout out to the Winter Garden Art Association and the Sobo Gallery for giving us the space to do this. And the Winter Garden Art Association is a 501c3 organization with the objective of expanding public access to the individual and fostering growth in the arts. The Sobo Gallery is located right here on South Boyd Street in historic downtown Winter Garden. So with that, the name of our episodes today is going to be Talking Turkey, Estate Planning 101. Before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about who we are. I'd like to hear a little bit about each of y'all's backgrounds. So
Sure.
Start with you.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Bondi. As you mentioned, I'm the Principal Attorney of Bondi Law. So we're a law firm focused on estate planning, probate, and real estate.
Okay. And?
Yep. So my name is Lana Larrabee, residential realtor with Preferred Real Estate Brokers. Been doing this full time for almost 6 years now, and really started getting into the probate and trust side of things that we'll talk about later about 1.5 years ago.
Awesome, thank you. And I'm Pete Bachsch, the Chief Investment Officer at First National Bank of Mount Dora and First Wealth and Trust here in Winter Garden as we're doing business here. In terms of starting this conversation out, estate planning, what does that term even mean?
Oh, that's a great question, and I think one that gets asked often, right? Because I think estate planning, people think that it only relates to really wealthy people. When you think of an estate, that it means it's a lot of assets, but really everyone has an estate, right? If you own a house or you own a car, or even nowadays, if you have digital assets, you have an estate that requires some type of management, whether that requires us to go through probate, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, or just thinking proactively of what you need to do today. So to me, an estate is just you and what you have as far as your things and your people you care about.
Another question that gets asked is what's the difference between a will and a trust?
That is a very common question. So a will is a directive document that says, when I pass away, this is what I want to happen. And so we look at that from your assets, your things, who you want those assets to go to, and then secondly, who's going to carry that out. So we would name a personal representative, or what a lot of people call executor, but in Florida, the legal term is a personal representative of who's going to carry out that process. The other thing is that a will works in conjunction with probate. I think there's a big misconception that people think if they have a will, that means they don't have to go through probate. And Lana probably sees that when people try and sell a house and they're like, oh, it was willed to me. Well, you still have to go through the probate process. And then a trust is considered a private agreement because there's the person who makes the trust, the grantor, and then the trustee. And most of the time that's the same people, but because there's two parties, it's a private agreement. And so that has a little more flexibility that you can bring assets in or out of the trust through the person's lifetime. And then it also incorporates the piece of the plan of distribution upon death, but that's handled privately without probate.
So for the person who might not be familiar with the term probate even, what does that mean?
Thank you for asking that. I guess I just assumed that people know certain things.
Yeah.
Maybe there are people that don't.
Absolutely. So probate is the process of administering an estate. So when someone passes away and we have a will, or even if we don't have a will, there has to be a process of transferring the assets from the deceased person's name to their legal beneficiary. So whether that's through a will or just through the state intestate statutes, there's a process that has to happen to make that occur. And that probate is process. Or that process is probate.
And I take it that that's essentially boiling down to the Florida court system making decisions based on that document as opposed to the individuals, where they might get a little bit more flexibility from the trust side of things or the estate planning side of things in that context of the private agreement.
Somewhat. So the courts don't make the decision. State laws are already set. So there's a set of statutes that are called intestate succession that says if you die without a will, which is intestate, this is what would happen to your assets based on your familial status. So if you're married, how much would go to your spouse? If you have children, how much goes to your children? And then goes through your family tree, parents, siblings, nieces, nephews, etc. So it kind of has fingers to find all the people, because another misconception is people think if they don't have a will, the state's going to get all their stuff.
Take everything,
And
right?
I mean, I guess sometimes it can be a conduit because there is a unclaimed property through the state, but really the legal beneficiary is whomever is either named in the will or trust, or whoever is the legal beneficiary according to the intestate statutes.
Yeah.
But a trust gives you so much more flexibility, because as we think about what we would want to happen, sometimes that doesn't line up with what the state statute says. And so a lot of times people are utilizing the trust either to make some other distributions or to have a little more control beyond death. So sometimes people want to say, I don't just want someone to receive a lump sum payout when I pass away. I'd like there to be some structure around that, and a trust allows us to do that.
Well, and like you said, you know, families with young children, right? My husband and I travel together a lot, of course. Should something happen to us, we would definitely not want, you know, one large lump sum, right? So it's important to pick kind of how things are going to be disseminated to who at what time. And that's really great to have that trust and have that flexibility, that control. And you can set it up in different ways correctly. So should one person pass, this is how it will go. Should you both pass, this is how it will go, and who those decision makers would be moving forward.
So let's say that you've already done the estate planning, and, you know, I guess what steps do you need to take to communicate that to people so that everything gets taken care of correctly?
That's a great question. So usually what I tell people is they want to let their family member know that their estate plan exists. Sometimes I would suggest they don't share it, because that can cause some of the family disagreements if someone's not happy with what's in the document.
Sure.
But just knowing that the document exists is key, and then where it's located. So if someone has a safe deposit box at the bank, or if they've got a fireproof safe at home, or if it's at the attorney's office, where is that document located? And then with the lifetime documents, like the power of attorney healthcare directive, I say you should give those copies of the documents to the person that you've named, because in order for them to use them, they have to have the documents. If they're just sitting in a box, they're not going to do us any good.
This is true.
That's interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that piece about the power of attorney paperwork. So, yeah, I mean, I think just keeping everybody involved, right? Or at least just letting them know, hey, I've named you, because I had a client call earlier this year. I'd never spoken with this gentleman before. His estranged father had passed away. He didn't know, and he had been named the personal representative. Well, he lives in New Jersey. He has never even lived in Florida. He didn't really know where to start, right? So there was this fluster, this, anxiety. Everything was coming at him very quickly. And maybe if he would have at least known about that piece, or if he and his dad had had that conversation while they were still on good terms, maybe he could have been just a little bit more prepared.
Yeah, and one of the things I can think of is, having a corporate trustee as opposed to an individual in the family as a trustee. It probably makes sense to have an uninterested third party that's not going to be biased handling things, and that might be a reason why you'd use one.
Sure. Yeah, I think that would make sense, especially if you have maybe a lot of children, right? Or children and grandchildren, and you're not really sure, or you don't want to put that burden on one of them in particular Do you see that?
Absolutely. I can think of several reasons when I recommend a corporate trustee. One, if we are talking about an individual who doesn't have a spouse or children, so sometimes people, have close relationships with other family members or friends or neighbors,
Sure.
but they don't necessarily have kind of their default, I'm using air quotes, person of who they would want to be named as their successor trustee. So I would recommend a corporate trustee in that scenario. Also, if there are multiple children who they're worried about there being some disagreement or concerns with fairness, because when money comes into play, people want things to be fair. And so I think when they have a corporate trustee, it's like you said, easy to remove the emotion. And then we can say, hey, you don't have to come to your sibling then and say, okay, can I have a $10,000 distribution, right? It will have language written into their trust. And then there's a corporate trustee that handles that kind of mechanics of the carrying out the wishes.
What are the basic questions that you ask as an attorney practicing in this area to kind of understand what the needs are of any individual, where they need to be going, what they need to be doing?
Some of the things that I think the clients should consider, people, when you're mentioning having a family conversation, is two parts. So a lot of people focus on just what happens when I die, and that sometimes is hard for them to talk about because no one wants to bring on the thought of their passing or their family passing. I know sometimes it's the adult children who don't want to talk about their aging parents passing away because I don't want to think about my mom dying.
Sure.
But some of the questions they should ask are just, do you have a list of your assets? Because that's one thing that comes up very often in probate, and Lana, I'm sure you deal with this when people are even just trying to figure out whose name is on the deed, right? Or where you have a bank account at. Sometimes if you don't share the list of assets, that's really big. So finding out what the makeup of their assets are is number one. And then two is just who are your important people? So most of the time people assume that your spouse is going to be the primary person to take care of things, but at some point you'll be the survivor of your spouse, or we have people who are not married. And so who is that important person that you want to manage things? So I think those are the two primary things that people should get comfortable talking about.
Yeah.
Sure. And from your perspective, you all work in the same sort of sphere.
Yep.
Tell me a little bit about how your practice is involved with this.
Yes, very similar, right? So the first piece is really, are we allowed to sell the home? Is it still going through the probate process? Has a beneficiary or a personal representative been selected? Those are all things we need to know before we can even consider things like an estate sale, getting the home clean, getting it prepared for sale. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of things on the front end that we want to make sure we've checked off before we even talk about selling the personal property.
So coming into this, there was kind of some thought to this as to how we were going to ask some questions and get to the nuts and bolts of what happens. But, you're saying that in terms of even learning whether or not you can sell a property and how to get it ready for that disposition, so to speak. But even, at a broader level, I suppose the purpose is entirely different than dealing in traditional real estate, families that are moving. Maybe talk a little bit about that, how it fits.
Yeah, so of course there is maybe a slightly higher level of empathy that needs to be involved when you're dealing with someone who's in an emotional state, or maybe we have a lot of different heirs, and so it's kind of tracking all of those people down and making sure that they're aware of what's going on. Everyone's on board. We have the proper people signing the necessary documents, and then also keeping that train moving forward, right? So a bit of that empathy piece, but also keeping everybody on track so that we all kind of make it to that goal together and on time.
Gotcha.
Yep.
And in terms of the estate planning piece, starting out, when's it appropriate for someone to start thinking about this in broad strokes?
I hate to sound cliche and say everyone needs an estate plan, but really I've had clients as young as 18. Sometimes I've done estate plans for the parents, and then they start to realize, oh, my child's going off to college. What if something happens to them, right? Because once a child is 18, even though they're still your child, they're legally an adult. And so an 18-year-old may have a need, not to say that they need a full-blown full-blown trust and some complicated plan, but we still do need to have our basic documents in place. So what happens to their things, especially nowadays, as I mentioned, digital assets being so huge. If you want to access someone's Facebook account or their Apple photos, Google photos, having a will that says this person can access my digital assets really comes in handy nowadays. And then lifetime documents like a power of attorney or healthcare directive to say, not only if I die, but while I'm alive, if something happens to me, I get in a car accident, who can make medical decisions for me? So anyone who's over 18, but I think it comes even more significant once you have children, because that's, I think, when people start to think, gosh, if something happened to me, who's going to take care of my kids? And again, you assume that your spouse, but if you don't have a spouse or you die in a common accident, right? My husband and I go on vacation, we're flying together. So it could be that we get in an accident together. So you need to be thinking about that. So I think once you start, either if you don't hit it when you're 18 and be really proactive, once you start having kids, I think it's really time to start thinking about, planning for your loved ones.
Sure, there's that, and then I would imagine just acquiring real estate, that complicates things as well. Even in the absence of having kids to worry about where it's going, right?
Absolutely. So if I have a client, whether they have children or not, as we're going through the stages of purchasing or selling property, I always ask them, do you have a will? Do you have a trust? Is this something that we need to add to that or something that needs to be updated? Don't forget that we need to, check that box off as well. Because there's a lot going on, real estate can be highly emotional for some people, whether they're selling or purchasing. And I always try to just be very proactive and keep them on that trajectory and give them their little checklists as we go.
Gotcha. And I suppose in terms of the benefits to doing that in advance versus not, how about we talk about that? What are the consequences if somebody does not address these things? Maybe a case study or two, you can leave the names anonymous and maybe some of the key details, but broad strokes.
Yeah, I have no shortage of horror stories for people who haven't completed their plan. One that comes to mind is an unmarried couple. So I had a couple that had been together for 30 plus years, and they had done actually a handwritten will, so they did attempt to plan. It's just not valid in Florida. Oh. And so the surviving partner, she came in and thought that we were going to be transferring their vacation condo down in Pompano and these accounts that were only in her partner's name, and come to find out the will wasn't valid. And so his assets actually went to his estranged grandchildren who he had zero relationship with. And we're talking $1.5 million that she didn't receive because there was not proper planning in place. And another one that comes up often is if people are on a second marriage. And that's, so we had the unmarried couple, but if you're on a second marriage, sometimes people assume that when I die, my spouse is going to get everything. If you don't have planning documents in place, that is not the case when you're talking about a second marriage, because the state laws provide for your spouse, but also your children that are not in common with your spouse. So that's something that I've had difficult conversations with people who come in and, hey, my spouse has passed away. And like Lana mentions, in a very fragile state already. And for me to have to break this bad news that your house that you think is going to be 100% titled to you is actually going to be shared with your spouse's children from his prior marriage.
Right.
And Lana's probably dealt with that.
Who you have no relationship with. Yeah.
Right.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a bit of a complex situation. I guess that led, while you were mentioning these, I'm sure there are a lot of folks out there that want to go out on LegalZoom and do this do-it-yourself type thing. Maybe they want to sell the house themselves. We'll get to that one here in a second too. But, what's your advice in that situation, or maybe your words about it?
That is a great question. And one thing that I think I always get people to pause and stop is when they ask me, well, after I've quoted them what their, package is going to include and what it's going to take, well, what's the difference between, what you're preparing for me and what I get on LegalZoom? And my question is always, well, if you go and do it on LegalZoom, how are you going to know if it's right? I don't question people's comprehension level, that their ability to read the document, but if you're not well versed in the state laws, you don't know what provisions should be included, what provisions shouldn't be in your document, and then how to make those corrections, because if it's incorrect, we don't find out until you pass away and there's no ability to fix it, right? It's only, like I mentioned.
Too late.
Yeah, once the spouse has passed away and then we realize, oh, their will, doesn't meet the Florida guidelines, so we can't use this in probate, something like that, and then it's already done. So I'd say there's a really high consequence of doing it yourself if you're not knowledgeable in those areas. Even when it comes to using AI and ChatGPT, it's only as good as what you prompt it with. And so if you don't know to say, oh, well, what about this and what about this? Do I need special language for this provision? It's not going to tell you.
Yeah, that makes sense. We could get into a really deep discussion involving the AI stuff, but I'll clip that there for now, table it. But yeah, from your perspective, like somebody, you see these, say there's some estate and they're handling it themselves and they go out there for sale by owner. What are some of the perils of that?
Sure. Well, I mean, the initial difficulty is obviously if you're trying to sell the home on your own, estate or otherwise, you're doing everything yourself, right? So did you have professional photography done or did you use your cell phone? Are you handling showings yourself and are you there for all of those? And then when you get into the actual offer side of things, do you know how to read Florida real estate contracts? Do you know that they were filled out properly? Most people don't believe it when I tell them, but 35% of for sale by owners actually end up in litigation after they close.
That's a surprising statistic.
Because something wasn't filled out properly or expectations weren't met and agreed to accordingly. So it's a huge risk that you're taking to try and save, let's say, 6% collectively on the sale of your home.
Sure.
So it's a big risk. I know a lot of people have done it themselves and they do it, maybe 2 or 3 times in their lifetime, but you're taking that against an agent who is doing, 30 or 40 deals a year. Yeah. So it's worth it to save yourself a huge potential headache and a huge potential loss. And then we also know just traditionally for sale by owners sell for about 18% less than a home sold with an agent. So you're trying to save 6% while possibly losing 18.
Yeah, that's surprising, but then again, not.
Yeah. Well, the buyers also, when they go to for sale by owners, they usually are represented by their agent. Mm-hmm. So they have someone backing them and they feel fully confident they can take advantage of that seller and negotiate quite aggressively because they don't have that representation.
Yeah, I'm glad Lana mentioned about the filling out the contract correctly, because that's another thing kind of with the estate plan and with the real estate contracts especially, there's a section for additional terms, and people think when they type this in that everybody has the same interpretation of those words, and if your words are not expressly clear that this means this, then it could be that the other party interprets that sentence a different way. And so having a lawyer or a professional real estate agent involved to say, whoa, no, we can't say that, here's how we need to word it to make sure that both parties think this sentence means the same thing.
Yes.
Yeah, that is a huge thing to think about. Communication's difficult enough as it is in verbal, and then you put it down on paper, and I can see where that happens. It's probably a big, big problem. This brings to mind, the ongoing nature of this. This is organic. This is a system. This isn't something that happens discreetly, is it? An estate plan, planning for the future, disposition of assets, things of that nature. Maybe walk me through somebody that starts out early and how that might evolve over the course of their lives.
I tell people to try and look at their plan every 5 to 10 years if nothing consequential has happened. Otherwise, if there's a death in the family, a birth in the family, a marriage, a divorce, some of those triggering events, you should always look at your plan. But I would say, every 5 to 10 years, just kind of reassess. As Lana mentioned, do we need to update your will, right? Someone purchases a property and they forget they need to name it into their trust. Then that's something that when we're just doing our kind of semi-annual review or something like that, I can say, okay, well, what are your assets? And we pull the titles, and then I could say, oh, wait, it looks like this is still in your individual name. We need to transfer it. Or even if it's joint ownership, right, making sure it's got survivorship language so that we can avoid probate when one of the joint owners pass away. So,
Sure.
So yes, it's definitely an ongoing process.
Yeah. And I imagine the valuations of things are being updated from time to time, and people are consulting you. This dovetails into the next question is, how does this ecosystem all fit together? You know, I'm here representing First Wealth and Trust and the First National Bank. We're obviously in the business of administering these trusts as the trustee, or in my case, as the investment person. But, you know, in terms of a team approach to achieving the client's goals, how do you all like to work with an organization like mine or hers and vice versa? Maybe tell me about how those relationships work from your perspective.
I always say you need an attorney, a banker, and CPA. So those are my ABCs, right? So having an attorney and then the banker, because as I mentioned, trying to find all those assets, a lot of times if you have a great relationship with your banker, they're going to know where all the assets are. And then also you'll check beneficiaries, right? You'll be the one to say, let's make sure we've got a beneficiary named on that account. And the CPA, because that's always the person who's going to help us understand, you know, tax consequences. That's a question that I get fairly frequently, and it's outside of my wheelhouse, right? And it could be very fact specific. And then having a realtor involved who focuses on the probate and trust side of things, because not everybody does. A lot of realtors who, you know, focus on the traditional sale and purchase, like you mentioned, people are relocating, but someone who understands when they look at a trust, you know, what this document, you know, somewhat looks like, has familiarity with the process of probate, because it makes it so much easier, especially when it's already just an overwhelming process.
Yes.
Gotcha. Yeah, and that's a thing. So that's a specialty that you have.
Yes.
Maybe walk me through a little bit more of the detail of how that works and what attracts you to that, and what it means for the clients and what it means for someone like myself or my bank or you know, First Wealth and Trust, who's stepping in to act as the trustee.
Sure. So I kind of make it my mission to handle all of the individual pieces, right? So previously, or if you're working with a realtor who doesn't specialize in this, they're most of the time not going to have the resources for a estate sale company to come view what's remaining in the home after the family has come and collected the things that they'd like to take with them. So I have several of those different companies that I can call on at any point in time and come take inventory and do the estate sale. And we try and get that done from start to finish in about 7 days' time, okay? And then next up is my clean out crews, right? So I have several different companies of those as well that will come and clean the home out after the estate sale is done. Again, we have confirmed with the family they've taken everything that they want from the property. We're cleaning the home out. And then lastly, cleaning it up, having the cleaning crew come in. So it's my job as representing, you know, the bank, my attorneys, that I handle all of that for you. You know, that's not a headache or a burden that you should be worried about spending time on, and it's certainly not the headache or the burden of the beneficiary or the heirs to be concerned with. So I take care of all of those pieces, and then of course we kind of from there launch into the traditional listing of the property with professional photography, so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I think I'm getting that the ultimate goal is to get the best outcome for everybody.
Of course,
And,
right. Yeah, it's all of our
That's
goals, I
across the
think,
table.
collectively to do what's best for our clients. And when it comes to selling assets and selling property, to also get them the most for that. So.
The biggest takeaway that I'm taking from this is, you know, it's not only a team approach in our organization at First Wealth and Trust, it's a team. There's a team of teams that's coming together
Yes,
and really providing
absolutely.
an overall experience for the clients. So that's really encouraging and really cool.
Yeah.
Like to thank you, Jennifer, Lana, for joining me on this episode. And
Yeah, thank you.
yeah, you know, and just to be clear, we're talking about complex stuff here. Investments, estate planning, real estate, these are complicated things. What we're talking about here is in generalities. So
Yeah.
this is not for any one given person's situation or one family situation. If you do have questions about that, feel free to reach out to us at First Wealth and Trust. Feel free to reach out to these ladies at their organization, but you do need to consult with the experts before you make any decisions based on the stuff we're talking about here. Thanks. See you in the next episode.